Well, at first we were all alone, and then the people started to arrive, and it's wonderful. There are many young people from many institutions. And I guess also from various movements, no, organizations.
Of course.
Not only academic, but...
Buenas tardes, vamos a reempezar. Entonces, como les anunciaba al principio en la inauguración, la segunda parte de la mañana es dedicada a una mesa redonda donde sobre todo quisiéramos favorecer el intercambio entre todos nosotros que estamos en la mesa y también el intercambio con ustedes, ¿no? Para que pueda haber preguntas, reacciones, comentarios, etcétera, ¿no? Esta primera mesa redonda tiene como tema principal Miradas al pasado, estudios femeninos, estudios sobre las mujeres. La idea central de nuestra mesa ahora es reabrir el pasado, mirar hacia 30 años, hacia 40 años, para ver cuál era o cuáles eran los contextos en los que se fundaron nuestros centros de investigación. Tanto, digamos, el PIEM, efectivamente, pero también el CEFEG y también el Centro de Liderazgo en Malasia, ¿no? Entonces, es un poco comparar o poner en paralelo historias diferentes de institucionalización de los estudios de género. En esta mesa, pues, bueno, ya saben un poco, pero voy a hacer una presentación breve de todos los ponentes, ¿no? Primero, bueno, Emmanuelle, Berger, quien acaba de dar la conferencia, quien ha sido presentada, pero para los que no estaban todavía, decir brevemente que fue profesora de literatura francesa en la Universidad de Cornell hasta 2007. Actualmente es profesora de literatura francesa y estudios de género en la Universidad de París 8, donde encabeza el Centro de Estudios de la Mujer y de Género. También ha dirigido el recientemente fundado Instituto de Género, que es un instituto de investigación de ámbito nacional creada bajo el CNRS, ¿no? También podemos añadir sus líneas de investigación que incluyen teoría feminista, la teoría de género, como nos lo acaba de probar, ¿no? Teoría queer, la política del lenguaje en el Magreb, poesía francesa del siglo XIX, literatura y filosofía durante la Ilustración y filosofía continental. Dirige entonces el CEFEG, que ha sido fundado en 1973-74, o sea, estamos entre los dos años, ¿no? Su colega que trabaja con ella es Fassin, que hemos recibido en varias ocasiones aquí en el marco de la Cátedra Simone de Beauvoir. También conocemos pues, su obra a través de un cuaderno Simone de Beauvoir que ha sido publicado aquí y también más allá. Eric es profesor del Departamento de Ciencia Política y del Centro de Estudios Femeninos y de Estudios de Género de la Universidad de París 8. Sociólogo comprometido y bien comprometido. Sus investigaciones se enfocan en los procesos de politización de las cuestiones sexuales y raciales en Francia y en los Estados Unidos de América y de sus relaciones e interacciones, particularmente en el campo de las identidades nacionales y de la inmigración en Francia y en Europa. Luego les quiero presentar a Bahiyah Dato Abdul Hamid, profesora adjunta y subdirectora del Centro de Liderazgo de la Mujer, Tun Fatima Hashim, de la Universidad Kebangsaan Malasia en Malasia, donde se dedica a la planeación, organización, investigación, práctica y difusión de conocimientos sobre el liderazgo. Todos los programas y actividades del centro están enfocados a estas alianzas con la comunidad, la sociedad civil, así como los sectores público y privado. Bahiyah fue directora por 2 periodos consecutivos del Centro de Investigación sobre Género de la Facultad de Ciencias Sociales de la misma universidad, en el cual fue reestructurado, actualizado y ahora recibe el nombre de Tun Fatima Hashim. Fue vicepresidenta de SAMA, siglas en inglés de la Asociación del Sudeste Asiático para los Estudios de Género, con sede en Malasia, por 2 periodos y de la cual es miembro activo. Por último, les voy a presentar a mi colega Soledad González, doctora en Historia y Antropología de América por la Universidad Complutense de Madrid. Forma parte del PM desde hace mucho, desde sus inicios casi, por eso nos acompaña aquí. Sus temas de investigación giran en torno a las relaciones de género en las familias y la condición de las mujeres en el contexto de las transformaciones ocurridas en el campo mexicano a lo largo del siglo XX. Se ha interesado especialmente por la violencia doméstica, los derechos sexuales y reproductivos y el acceso de las mujeres a las instituciones de salud y de justicia. Entonces, pues nuestra idea es, como decía, mirar hacia el pasado. En abril pasado, justamente, o sea, no hace mucho, pero estuvimos celebrando conjuntamente los 40 años del Centro de Estudios Sociológicos aquí y los 30 años del PIEM, ¿no? Y en esta misma línea, pero ahora desplazándonos y comparando un poco las historias de las instituciones, queremos un poco, pues, hablar qué es lo que ha pasado en cada país. Entonces, nosotras, con Soledad, quizás vayamos a volver a contar un poco qué es lo que ha pasado cuando se fundó el PIEM en 1983, cuál fue el periodo que lo precedió, porque una institución, un programa, para que un programa de estudios de la mujer naciera no era tan fácil, vamos a ver, y cuáles fueron los obstáculos que se consiguió, qué negociaciones hubo que hacer para que esto pasara y con qué ímpetu las colegas han instituido el programa y hasta dónde hemos llegado hoy en día, ¿no? Entonces, bueno, es vasto el programa, pero eso es la idea de esta segunda parte de la mañana. Entonces, primero voy a dejar la palabra a Soledad.
Bueno, buenas tardes, es un gusto poder estar aquí con ustedes para... a ver.
Sí.
¿Qué tengo que hacer?
Acercarte.
Bueno, ahí está. Sí, es un gusto estar con ustedes para reconstruir un poco parte de esta historia de los estudios de las mujeres inicialmente y los estudios de género posteriormente en México. Aquí en México los primeros programas académicos se llamaron Estudios de la Mujer, no Women's Studies como en Estados Unidos. El mismo nombre del PIEM, Programa Interdisciplinario de Estudios de la Mujer, en singular, nos dice que fue fundado a principios de los 80, cuando las feministas académicas estaban empeñadas en hacer visible la subordinación femenina y la desigualdad entre los sexos. Las preguntas que se hacían en aquel contexto eran de carácter muy general y todavía no se conocían los textos de las feministas afroamericanas, chicanas y de la India, que cuestionaron la universalidad de la categoría mujer al plantear que el ser mujer y la opresión se viven de muy diversas maneras según la clase, la pertenencia étnica, la religión y la orientación sexual. A mediados de los 90, cuando ya teníamos 10 años de vida, nos decían que estábamos anticuadas y que teníamos que cambiarle el nombre por estudios de género. Pero no quisimos hacerlo porque queríamos conservar la marca de la historia, del origen, de la fundación de nuestro programa. Los orígenes de estos programas pienso que tienen que ver sobre todo con dos cosas. Por un lado, el hecho de que había crecido una masa crítica de feministas que eran profesionistas e investigadoras académicas que querían abrir espacios en la academia para estos estudios, y por el otro lado, el hecho de que los gobiernos que se consideraban modernos o modernizantes tenían que adoptar los lineamientos de Naciones Unidas y del Banco Mundial sobre los nuevos estándares de la modernidad que incluían incorporar a las mujeres al desarrollo, hacer visible su contribución a las economías y también reconocer que estaban en desventaja. Un antecedente importante para la creación de los programas académicos sobre las mujeres en México fue el que Naciones Unidas declarara 1975 como Año Internacional de la Mujer y México fue la sede de la Conferencia General sobre la Mujer. Bueno, las organizaciones feministas mexicanas estuvieron en contra de esta conferencia en los términos que estaba planteada, bajo el control de las delegaciones gubernamentales, y prepararon foros alternativos a los que acudieron representantes de corrientes muy diversas y radicales del feminismo europeo, norteamericano y latinoamericano. Las organizaciones feministas mexicanas ya venían trabajando desde los 70 para posicionar los problemas de las mujeres ante la opinión pública y la agenda gubernamental, especialmente la cuestión del derecho a la maternidad voluntaria, la educación sexual, el acceso a los anticonceptivos y la cuestión de la violencia contra las mujeres. Fueron las organizaciones no gubernamentales que trabajaban con mujeres víctimas de violencia sexual las que hicieron los primeros estudios para hacer visible el problema, que luego fue retomado por la investigación académica. Las organizaciones son las que señalaron que no había programas de las instituciones públicas dirigidos a dar respuestas a las necesidades de atención de las víctimas y de educación en la prevención. También impulsaron la transformación de la legislación para tipificar los delitos de violencia intrafamiliar. Este es el problema social sobre el que ha habido más continuidad en la acción de las organizaciones y debo decir que aquí la investigación académica tuvo un papel de apoyo fundamental, diseñando, analizando e interpretando encuestas que permitieron conocer la magnitud y las características del problema. Hasta hace poco, la historia del feminismo mexicano en los años 70 nos hablaba de que el movimiento de liberación femenina estaba integrado sobre todo por mujeres de clase media, profesionistas, académicas y escritoras. Flora Botton, que tuvo un papel fundamental en la creación del PIEM, nos dice que ellas leían El segundo sexo y debatían las obras de Betty Friedan, Shulamit Firestone y Kate Millett, y que autoras como Sheila Rowbotham, Syla Eisenstein y Juliet Mitchell tal vez eran más afines al pensamiento propio de América Latina, porque aunque criticaban al marxismo, trataban de conciliarlo con el feminismo. Es importante destacar que algunos estudios recientes han comenzado a reconstruir otras vertientes de la historia del feminismo y han documentado la emergencia de un feminismo popular e indígena que también tiene sus raíces en los años 70. Pero está claro que los programas académicos mexicanos fueron impulsados por académicas feministas, muchas de las cuales participaban en la revista FEM, creada en 1976, para teorizar sobre diversos aspectos de la opresión femenina y que fue punto de convergencia de un grupo amplio, plural y entusiasta de escritoras y académicas. Esta revista ejerció una gran influencia durante mucho tiempo y continuó publicando trabajos sobre temas nacionales e internacionales durante más de 30 años. Bueno, los programas académicos mexicanos se abrieron a principios de la década de 1980 y tuvieron algunos antecedentes importantes unos años antes. Reuniones sobre las investigaciones sobre la mujer en México y Centroamérica en el año 77 y otras reuniones en años subsiguientes, simposios sobre las investigaciones, los estudios en México. Estas reuniones mostraron que había necesidad de crear espacios académicos en los cuales se pudieran desarrollar investigaciones específicas sobre lo que entonces se llamaba la condición de la mujer. En 1982 se creó el área Mujer, Identidad y Poder en el Departamento de Política y Cultura de la Universidad Autónoma Metropolitana en Xochimilco, y un año después se creó nuestro PIEM. En la UNAM, en 1984, se abrió el Centro de Estudios de la Mujer en la Facultad de Psicología, que en 1993 dio lugar al Programa Universitario de Estudios de Género. Voy a hablar un poco sobre los orígenes del PIEM y el hecho de que fue muy importante que este programa se radicara en el Colegio de México, que era una institución innovadora, bueno, lo sigue siendo, pero en aquel contexto era importante que estuviera abierta a distintas cuestiones, con centros muy diversos que convivían e interactuaban en un espacio pequeño. Esto favoreció el carácter interdisciplinario del programa, que fue una de sus marcas de origen y que hasta la actualidad tratamos de conservar. Fueron investigadoras de los centros de estudios de Asia y África, de estudios sociológicos y de estudios históricos, quienes le propusieron al presidente del colegio crear un espacio abierto a las investigaciones sobre lo que se llamaba los temas de la mujer. Aunque no todas las investigadoras que promovieron la creación del PIEM tenían una trayectoria feminista, coincidían en que era cada vez más necesario incorporar a la academia estas cuestiones. Y al recordar esta historia, Flora Botton, que tuvo un papel fundamental en la fundación del PIEM, cuenta que no era nada fácil la tarea de convencer tanto a las autoridades como a muchos de nuestros colegas. Y el hecho es de que tardaron 5 años en convencerlos y que el presidente del colegio diera el sí, gracias a que la Fundación Ford actuó de madrina y partera y dio un endowment, un apoyo financiero que permitió echar a andar al programa, con Elena Urrutia como primera coordinadora. Quiero señalar que Elena está aquí con nosotros y les pido un aplauso porque nos ha acompañado. Elena fue el pilar del PIEM a lo largo de estos 30 años de vida del programa. Ella formaba parte de la revista FEM y en el PIEM demostró toda su enorme capacidad organizativa y de convocar a estudiosas de diferentes disciplinas para generar un espacio de interlocución que eventualmente también incluyó a funcionarias de instituciones gubernamentales y a activistas de organizaciones feministas y del movimiento de mujeres. Para que se llevara adelante este proyecto, siempre fue fundamental el apoyo de investigadoras de diferentes centros del colegio y ellas fueron las que organizaron los primeros seminarios sobre lo que eran las prioridades en los estudios sobre la mujer y que ayudó esto a establecer las prioridades de este nuevo programa. Bueno, muy pronto se abrieron una serie de seminarios con temas muy diversos como familia, mujer y organización doméstica, trabajo e identidad femenina, participación social de la mujer en Asia y África, narrativas femeninas mexicanas del siglo XIX y XX y talleres sobre sexualidad. Y hay que subrayar también que el PIEM nació interdisciplinario y con una apertura a la cuestión internacional desde un inicio. Elena invitó a teóricas y activistas de diferentes instituciones y organizaciones, tanto de Estados Unidos como de Europa. Por ejemplo, Giselle Halimi vino a presentarnos el trabajo que realizaba en la organización feminista Choisir. Bueno, el endowment de la Fundación Ford tenía el objetivo de que el PIEM organizara el apoyo a investigaciones y, en efecto, inmediatamente después de la creación se creó un programa de apoyo a tesistas que hacían tesis de maestría y de doctorado e investigadores que ya tenían una trayectoria de investigación. Y el apoyo no era solo económico, y esto era muy importante en un momento que no había muchas fuentes de financiamiento, sino que también había un apoyo de asesorías colectivas e individuales por especialistas. Y a lo largo de los 20 años que funcionó este programa, se dio apoyo a más de 320 proyectos de investigación. Los resultados de estos trabajos aparecieron publicados en nuestras publicaciones. A la fecha tenemos cerca de 60 títulos publicados y en su mayoría son resultado de estas investigaciones, aunque también en un inicio sobre todo se tradujeron obras teóricas importantes y de investigación que eran importantes en su momento. Ahora, otro aspecto muy importante de la labor del PIEM ha sido la formación de nuevas generaciones de profesionales, especialistas en los estudios de las mujeres y de género, y esto empezó bastante pronto, después de la fundación. Los cursos de verano han tenido un impacto muy importante entre gente interesada que llega de provincias a actualizarse en los estudios de género. Se iniciaron en 1989 y han sido una forma de docencia que ha tenido un efecto multiplicador muy importante. Luego, el curso de especialización se abrió en el año 91 y en 2003 se transformó en maestría en estudios de género. Y debo decir que muchas de las nuevas generaciones de investigadoras que trabajan en instituciones académicas, en distintas instituciones del país, son exalumnas o exalumnos nuestros, y también muchos han trabajado en instituciones públicas, como el Instituto Nacional de las Mujeres, el Consejo Nacional contra el SIDA, el Consejo Nacional para prevenir la discriminación. Bueno, Karine también nos pidió que, además de dar un panorama del contexto en el que se crearon estos programas y del trabajo que realizó el PIEM en particular, nos dijo que tocáramos los problemas que enfrentaron inicialmente los estudios de género en los espacios académicos. Bueno, un problema que enfrentamos en el PIEM, sobre todo al principio, fue la cuestión de los prejuicios sobre estos estudios, las sospechas de que el trabajo que se hacía era poco riguroso o demasiado ideologizado, el hecho de que el feminismo académico tuviera o tenga un compromiso con aportar conocimientos, información y reflexión para la transformación social y de modelos culturales muy arraigados, siempre ha generado la desconfianza sobre la objetividad científica de las investigaciones. Muchos colegas se han renovado en términos teóricos, pero desgraciadamente todavía hay muchos que permanecen bastante impermeables a los aportes teóricos y empíricos que se han hecho en estos estudios en los últimos 3 años. Por otro lado está la cuestión de la crítica que no viene desde posiciones conservadoras, sino las que vienen por el lado de las, digamos, posiciones más críticas que dicen que al convertirse los estudios de las mujeres en estudios de género, se perdió la fuerza cuestionadora, ese ímpetu contestatario feminista que se tenía en los primeros tiempos. Pienso personalmente que este potencial cuestionador sigue ahí, pero ahora desplegarlo depende cada vez más de los académicos y académicas individuales, mientras que en los 80 o incluso en los 90 tenían mucho más fuerza los proyectos colectivos que le imprimían un carácter contestatario a los programas. Por último, me quiero referir a otra cuestión que creo que en algún momento sí llegó a convertirse en problema, y es que desde los inicios de los programas de estudios de las mujeres y luego de género, las instituciones públicas les han pedido a estos programas capacitaciones para su personal. Esto porque al firmar los acuerdos emanados de las conferencias internacionales como las de población y desarrollo de Cairo 94 y la de la mujer de Beijing en 95, el Gobierno de México se comprometió a llevar adelante acciones para institucionalizar el enfoque de género. Esto implicó no solo la creación de programas a favor de la equidad entre los sexos y de los derechos de las mujeres, sino que también era necesario educar a los funcionarios y realizar capacitaciones sobre qué es esto del enfoque de género, que pasó a convertirse en una política de Estado. Y para saber qué es el enfoque de género, las instituciones públicas les pidieron a las académicas que les impartieran talleres y diplomados a los funcionarios. Esto de hacer talleres y diplomados fue una gran tentación porque parecía que era una posibilidad de transformar mentalidades y prácticas institucionales. Muchas instituciones académicas, como el PIE mismo en su momento, sucumbieron a esta tentación o lo siguen haciendo. El problema no es solo que somos pocas y hacemos muchas cosas y la demanda de formación de funcionarios se suma a una agenda de investigación y docencia de por sí bastante cargada. Pienso que el problema principal es que después de 20 años en que el feminismo le ha apostado a las capacitaciones, la gran pregunta es qué se ha logrado cambiar, y algunas investigaciones recientes nos dicen que es poco y nada lo que se ha logrado cambiar a través de este instrumento de las capacitaciones, porque las constricciones estructurales de las instituciones son demasiado fuertes y obligan a dinámicas institucionales particulares que trascienden los puntos de vista individuales de sus integrantes. Bueno, para finalizar, no sé si existe una historia que haga un balance de los logros y alcances de los estudios de género. Me parece que está por hacerse y que cuando se haga tiene que dar cuenta de toda la complejidad que está involucrada en un quehacer académico que también pretende o debiera pretender contribuir a la transformación social. Aquí solo he podido señalar algunos aspectos y cuestiones que probablemente fueron compartidos por otros programas en sus primeras etapas, pero también me imagino que hay procesos diversos y que cada institución tiene su propia historia que contar. Y en este sentido me parece muy importante, provechoso, este comienzo de ejercicio al que nos ha lanzado Karine y a través de estas jornadas. Bueno, yo lo dejaría hasta aquí. Muchas gracias.
Muchísimas gracias, Soledad, por haber hecho una síntesis excelente de los 30 años, pasando por todo lo que ha pasado el PM. O sea, luego vamos a retomar puntos o recordar cosas, pero sí es a grandes rasgos, para los que no conocen el PM, pues una buena síntesis. Ahora voy a dejar la palabra a Emmanuelle Berger, que nos va a contar sobre la fundación del CEFEG.
Thank you. I don't think I'm going to talk about the whole history of our center, but I'm going to stress a few points. As I said already this morning, our center was created in the early 70s, at the time when the first women's studies programs were also being created in the US, and so I think it's important. As for the women's studies programs in the US, the context was threefold, at least for us. On the one hand, as we know, the upheavals of the 60s throughout the Western world. Oh, I have to slow down? Okay. So it's hard to converse and be slow at the same time, but so the upheavals of the 60s throughout the Western world gave center place for the first time to questions of sexuality, sexual conduct, sexual repression, sexual roles, and sexual liberation, thus precipitating the formation of socio-political movements centered around the question of sex in all its dimensions, the women's movements, and the first movements for the social liberation and cultural recognition of homosexuality. And as we know, Foucault has dealt with this cultural and political shift in the West, and in a way his history of sexuality can be read as an attempt to account for, and in some ways also settle the accounts with, what we refer to as 68 in France. So that's one element of context. On the epistemological and philosophical levels, the late 60s and early 70s were also a time of upheaval, with the mounting critique of Western humanism and its grand narratives, and the beginning of the decentering move that paved the way for the emergence of post-colonial and minority studies and perspectives. And then on a more minute plane, and I think this will echo what you were saying about Colmex and about the special nature of the Colmex, there was the creation of our university, which was called Vincennes at the time, which was a leftist university, still is, largely, and which was a token. It was created in '69, and it was a token given to the faculty and student insurgents of '68 by the French government, and so that was put in place in the wake of the revolutionary episode, and which became immediately the brewing pot for what was later identified in the US as French theory, with such faculty members as Sixou, the founder of the center, Deleuze, Lyotard, briefly Foucault, briefly Irigaray, François Châtelet, and later on Badiou, Rancière, etc. Without Vincennes, as it was called, I believe a center like ours couldn't have been created. And one would probably have to have waited until at least the late 80s for women's or gender studies to become an academic field anywhere in France. No, maybe Eric can say something about this. Many new fields emerged at Vincennes. The first department of cinema was created there, the first department of psychoanalysis, and Lacanian psychoanalysis at that, the first department of educational sciences, which was a new thing at the time. So Vincennes was, like Colmex, the first French university where interdisciplinarity was both theorized and widely practiced. So that's for the context, I mean, very briefly again. Now, if I understood well, this roundtable is entitled, at least in French, Études féminines, études sur les femmes, feminine or feminist studies and women's studies. And since Soledad talked about the question of the name, I didn't know that, but you were strongly, your program was strongly urged, from what I understood, to change its name to gender studies at a certain point, and you decided finally not to do that for reasons which you explained, a certain, faithfulness to a certain history, etc. I'd like to say something about, indeed, the stakes of naming. Also because I speak from a double experience. I know the history of the French Center, but I've also witnessed an interesting history at Cornell University. As I was saying this morning, in fact, the very first program in the US to appear was at Cornell under the name Female Studies in 1969. And then it became, when it was institutionalized, Women's Studies in 1972. And then it changed its name in 2000, which is rather late, to Feminist gender and sexuality studies. And of course, behind the successive changes, there is a complicated political and intellectual history, which we can talk about. And what I find interesting is that, well, now in France there is a kind of consensus around the name gender studies. I'll say something, right after that about the name of our center. But I know that in the States, in the United States, they've made very different choices. Some programs have decided, like yours, to remain programs in women's studies. Others have become programs in feminist studies, others in gender studies or feminist or transnational feminist studies, etc. So, and then the program like the Cornell one decided to have it all, and so became feminist gender and sexuality studies. Now, so to go back to the name, and of course I want to say something about the intellectual and political stakes of our center. Our center at the beginning was called Centre d'études féminines, literally, although it's actually not, there is the complicated issue of translation, Center for Feminine Studies, and it became Center for Feminine Studies and Gender Studies in 2006, a change I suggested and you knew would be welcomed. Since the notion of études féminines, feminine studies, has led to questions, to interpretations as well as misinterpretations. And even today, some of our students look at such a name with incomprehension and unease. And indeed, as I was saying, the few programs that were created in France since then, in that field in France, never took on such a name. So here are a few insights on the question of the name. Of the original name, and I know because she told a few of us recently when we were interviewing her in preparation of our anniversary that Hélène Cixous had in mind when she created the Centre d'études féminines, the few already existing women's studies programs in the US. So that's when she came up both with the idea and the name études féminines. Now, the locution women's studies is what one calls in traditional grammar a double genitive. Sorry for the grammatical precision here. It means both, as we know, studies on women and studies by women, and that, of course, is crucial. Now, in French, and I have the feeling, but I may be wrong because I'm so, I have no Spanish at all, I have the feeling the same would be true in Spanish. You can't really say études de femmes, which would usually mean something like studies of women, like in portraits of women, or studies of women's bodies in painting. So you would then have to choose between études des femmes ou sur les femmes, on women, but in both cases that would mean studies on women. And you would have to choose between that then and some equivalent of studies by women. Obviously, Hélène Cixous wanted to have it both ways, as in English, and so she came up with études féminines, which can mean both studies on and by women, but doesn't only mean that, and I'll come back to this point shortly. There is perhaps also in études féminines a slight emphasis on the by that stresses both the agency and the viewpoint. Now, the question of the point of view of what came to be theorized later as situated epistemology was indeed crucial to the project. The idea was not only to study the traces and contours throughout history of the dark continent of womanhood, a continent obscured, overlooked, or neglected by an androcentric science, but also to allow an up to then and still minorized perspective to be both fully formulated and transmitted thanks to the academic setup. But then why feminine and not feminist? And what could feminine mean, that is, mean in the context of the early 70s in French? The early 70s were really the time of women, to borrow the title of a famous essay by Julia Kristeva, an essay which dates back from that time. It seems to me that the notion of feminism as both a political and a fully legitimate intellectual endeavor, gained currency later in both the US and the French Academy, in the wake of the constitution of feminist theory. And here again, I could take the example of what happened at Cornell University in this respect. Then, in French, contrary to English and German, we don't distinguish, or rather, our language prevents us from distinguishing clearly between femaleness, a primarily biological category, femininity, a cultural category, and womanhood, a social category. Yeah, that's English. And German itself has at least two words, Weib and Frau. When Freud asked before de Beauvoir how a female child became a woman, he asked not how she became a Frau, but how she became weibliche, literally wifely, the two words having the same root. That is, how she became domesticated, shaped for wifery in all the senses of the term in English. That is, bound for and to heterosexual marriage and or prostitution, according to the various meanings of wife and wifery in both Old and Modern English. So femininity in this case clearly means normative femininity. Now, in French, which is a very anthropocentric language, the lexical field of femaleness, and therefore the adjective female, are only employed with regard to non-human animals of the female sex. So when you use the word femininity in French, or feminine, you don't know what you're saying. It can refer to biology where humans are concerned, to culture, or to society, all at once or separately. I think Hélène Cixous liked this equivocity, which immediately raises the question of what constitutes femininity. Is it biological, cultural, social, all at once, or all at odds with one another? How do the biological, the cultural, and the social work to produce women, harmoniously or antagonistically? These are, of course, the core questions, or at least the questions of our field. But there was an additional twist to it. Some people thought that by putting forward the notion of the feminine in études féminines, one ran the risk of upholding and promoting femininity as a cultural norm or a regulatory ideal, thus upholding in the same thrust, albeit unwittingly, the traditional sexual binary and the social division of roles a women's studies program was meant to challenge. Yet, for Cixous, femininity, as she put it in play, never referred to anything normative. Quite the contrary, and so here I'm doing a little bit of intellectual history of our center. And in this respect, she was indeed close to Derrida's perspective on the matter. Femininity was for her the name of the repressed or the excluded of the cultural order, at least the name of what upset and could challenge, once it found a voice, the order of things, and particularly the order of language. During the year 1973-1974, Cixous wrote two essays, The Laugh of the Medusa, and Sortie, which was translated, I can't remember, as forays or something like this, in which she dealt with what she called écriture féminine, a notion unfortunately translated in English as women's writing, or worse, female writing. Yet, among the examples she gave of écriture féminine were Shakespeare, Heinrich Kleist, and Jean Genet. It is not then that there was or should be a literary writing specific or proper to women. Rather, the idea was that literary writing as such was feminine, that is, strange, other, both traditionally secundarized and vilified as fiction, and capable of challenging the logocentric order. In other words, here, feminine was not simply equated with female, not even with woman, which of course poses other kinds of questions or problems, but certainly cannot be suspected of contributing to the reification of normative gender differences. In a certain way, you could describe this as a kind of queer avant la lettre understanding of femininity. So the reason why I'm saying all this is that so we've made the choice in our center to now call ourselves Center for Études Féminines and Études de Genre, so to have it both ways, in a certain way, like you, and therefore to live with this legacy rather than dismissing it. Now, I just want to say a few words about but I think we will have time in our roundtables to talk about it, to go back to the history. Briefly, as I was also saying this morning, and as it is attested by the fact that, even though, as we know, French thought, etc., played a big role in the formation, in the intellectual formation of this field, usually people don't understand how it is that in France, in the French Academy, there are so few centers like ours, even though in the past few years, a number of programs of this type have started to flourish. So I want to say briefly two things about what we have known, which is to say, indeed, hostility, what we have encountered, and I think that which is, when you compare to what happened in the States, and for instance, from a North American point of view, not understandable. What is it in France? So I think, and I'm sure that Eric will have many more things to say about that. I see at least two reasons why it took, so long, and why it was so difficult to establish academic programs in women's and gender studies in France. On the one hand, I think it has to do with indeed our academic system, which is to say it's a state system, it's a centralized system, and therefore it lacks the flexibility that you have in American universities that are basically self-ruled. So I think that's a very important element. Then there is another one which has more to do with French political and intellectual history, and which is what I would call a certain French intellectual consensus that spans the whole political spectrum. In other words, it's not a question of being on the left or on the right. There is a particularly French brand of what is called universalism, and a very strong French tradition of universalism, which means that, which goes with, let's say, a big distrust with regard to anything that appears like threatening the unity of the community. And one has to say that attacks on centers like ours have come from right and left, or I should say from left and right, precisely in the name of universalism, because centers like ours were considered as ghetto centers, centers where the thing that one hates most in French, which is to say communitarianism, was bred and upheld, whereas we consider, at least I should speak for myself, I don't know what Eric will have to say about this, but I think we agree. Against that, what we say is that the questions we're dealing with, which is to say questions of gender differences and gender inequities, questions of sexual orientation and sexual rights, these are universal questions, far from being communitarian, ghettoist, particularist issues. These are issues that traverse every field of knowledge, as well as that are met in all social types of practices. So, but still, so this is what we have been dealing with, and the result has been a number of setbacks. Several times the center was threatened by the state, actually, of disappearance. I have to say that the center was set up right away as a PhD program, so that's important. It was a research center. That's how it was created. And much later, in other words, in 2005, we created a master's degree program, and we're still the only ones in France to offer both an interdisciplinary master's degree program in gender studies and a PhD program, interdisciplinary PhD program in gender studies. I think I'll stop here for now, and we can talk more later.
Muchísimas gracias, Anne, por pintarnos este panorama también y recordar que ustedes tienen el único programa de doctorado y de maestría, como acabas de decirlo, y me parece importante porque eso también son entre los obstáculos que hay, es porque hay tan pocos cuando la demanda es muy alta. O sea, si te parece, Eric, voy a dejar la palabra a Bahiyah antes. Sí, quisiera pues escuchar un poco, quizás que nos ofrezca el panorama, qué es lo que pasa en Malasia. Gracias.
Thank you very much. When we talk about women's studies and gender studies in Malaysia, we usually refrain from taking a stance like being feminists or feminism. Though we now do realize that there needs to be theorizing in this, and there are research that needs to be done, and therefore there needs to be toolkits and tools in which we need to explain, interpret our research. Now, let me give you a little bit of history of Malaysia. We intend to be a developed country in 2020. Most of what we do in the universities, in schools, in our daily lives, have to do with not just social, but also economy. Being a very tiny country, we do realize that that is how we sustain ourselves. Now, 1970s, 1960s were very, very important eras in our Malaysian history. Education is one very important aspect that the country aspires to, and we have had sent through scholarships a lot of students overseas. And one very important country that we have sent students to have been the US. In the 1970s, the US was very big in liberation and equality and so forth. And many of our students there became involved and interested. Knowing very well also that what they were sent there for to study would be a contract in which to make Malaysia a developed country. So the critical mass have been sent overseas, not just to the US, but the UK and so forth. And we had professionals coming in because we needed to think about the leadership of the country in years to come. Now, this group of scholars who have come back from the US have been very instrumental in the policy making where gender is concerned. And we really need to thank the government in this sense because this is where we started to think about women. In fact, before this independence, women have been very, very into fighting for equality as well, and fighting for the independence of the country. Women went into economy, they also had leadership positions, and not just the politics, but also in other matters. And there seemed to be an understanding that since women make half of the population, there needs to be, something there to keep women, to help in development. So in this case, we have looked into women's studies and gender, in development. So women in development, women, we went through all these, but the stance of Malaysia is women in development and now gender in development. Many people still in Malaysia think that, programs like gender studies and women's studies are very, very luxurious endeavors. Very luxurious. In fact, theorizing, having the time to think and so forth seem to be what a lot of people say, monies spent, what do we get back? So what has happened in my country is that women did research on women. And the conditions of women. It all started out with the first research clusters where women in the northern states got together and got some monies and looked into the state of poverty. That was the main concern. The parity, or the disparity between we really, look at the importance of this so that, there will be a balance in the society now. So that was our main concern, to look at the conditions of women within that aspect of poverty, looking then at how it is that we have economically moved, where women took great steps in working towards the economy. So we were first an agricultural-based economy, and then we moved on to the industrial-based economy in 1970s, 80s, and then now we want to become a knowledge-based economy. So basically, when we think about how the movement has been for women in that era, it has to do a lot with transforming society. So when we thought about this, it also meant that research needs to be carried out, statistics given, and so forth, because in the universities where all these academicians were working, we are mainly governmental. There are 20 government universities, in which I am from one. And the government looks for people in academia to be consulted upon. And research, mainly given by the government, will have to address concerns about women related to many aspects, many sectors in the government for this vision of 2020, meaning that we become a developed country. Now, when I talked about the luxury of becoming, of having gender and so forth, we've overcome a lot of this. In fact, the women who were sent overseas came and they are leaders in our society. And we have a lot to thank them for, because it took time to adjust this. And when these leaders, these women become leaders, they look at how important it is to see to not just policy making, but actually to train critical mass of women, as well as men, to look at theory, to take into consideration theory and interpretation, and also this intellectual discussion. Now, when we talk about gender, there's always a very bad a connotation, yeah, with gender, because there's always seemed to be a problem with gender and sex. And so to the educated and to these people who have not gotten into the discourse, yeah, it becomes something that is not understood very carefully, and many miscommunications have come out of this. And there have been also, communities, around these discussions and discourse, and that's why it also matters to have programs like gender studies to be educating, the masses, educating also, like what Professor Soledad was talking about, people in government, who are helping, women themselves and others to understand what it all means and what what can be out of these programs. So when I think about my own Center for Gender Studies, a gender research center, we started out really by researching. And these are groups of very dedicated people, women mostly, and we had to actually do a lot of advertising, discussions, held a lot of intellectual discussions with not just academy, other people, but also people in the ministry, people in the religious community, families. It's very important in Malaysia. The family unit is very much looked into, and also other stakeholders in this. Now, when we talk about femininity and masculinity and so forth, yes, research is being done in this. And there also is now a look into whether feminism can coexist with religion. Malaysia is made up of 60% Muslims, and therefore it becomes very, very important to look into this aspect, where a lot of people still do have very mixed and misunderstood aspect of this. Thinking about the body politics and so forth is a very new discourse to us, because traditionally we've not had and do not have these discussions outrightly. Only very recently, we have had this because of the NGOs and also because of the ministry that looks after women and community and welfare. And this is becoming something, a dialogue that may be difficult, but it has got to not be swept under the carpet. It has got to be, done sensitively. And so therefore, what has happened now is how to sustain this discourse, however, not to have, massive, something that's, negative. How to do this, because in Malaysia also, it's also becoming very politicized within ethnicity and religion. So it's a very complex aspect where it is revolving a lot of groups, NGOs at one side, really fighting for equality, equity, and so forth, and then you have, different pockets of people, really talking at different levels and, maybe sometimes not at each other. So there is no mutual, discussion. Many things like this, body politics, sexual orientation, and so forth, are submerged. And many times you will find a very important aspect now is the ICT, where we can actually learn about what is happening, so this is an alternate a way of discussing. And we are doing some research on this as well, as to see how it is that, dialogues can be brought forward rather than submerged in this sense. I think I will stop here. If you have any questions, you can ask me. But other than this being, a luxury, now a lot of people are swinging towards it being a necessity. I think we have, with the help of the government, with help of the NGOs and stakeholders, decide that it's no more being swept under. We need to actually look into this. So it's a necessity for us. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Bahiyah. Sí, yo tendría una pregunta breve, muy breve para Bahiyah. Quisiera saber cuándo se fundó el Centro de Liderazgo y también si incluye un programa de enseñanza tal como lo podemos tener nosotros, como la maestría o el doctorado. Muy breve.
Okay. The Women's Leadership Center was 2011 was when we established the Women's Leadership Center. Now, there seemed to be why is this center being set up? It's actually a national endeavor because we now are moving into the leadership aspect. So while gender mainstreaming has been going on, we now find that while we have a lot of women, women are not going up. So you will find a lot of this, in Malaysia, where women are educated, they are in very, a good professions, they move up, however, they don't move fast enough and up enough. So that's why this is moving. But it does not mean that we do not take women's studies and gender studies out from this equation. There needs to be this. However, we do not have a program. We do provide our resources, meaning expertise, from all parts of the university to do supervision. Mm-hmm. Yes. Thank you.
Ok, muchas gracias. Muchas gracias, Bahiyah, por esta precisión. Ahora creo que tenemos los tres contextos, pues Francia, Malasia, México, son contextos históricos y sociales bien diferentes y nos permiten ver similitudes, diferencias, factores, aspectos que entran en juego, como la religión en Malasia, que no tanto para nuestros contextos, bueno, para el contexto francés menos y quizás un poquito más para el contexto mexicano. Luego hay que medir todo esto, pero más o menos, ¿no? No sé, Eric, quisiera darte la palabra para que puedas reaccionar sobre estas tres ponencias.
Ok, muchas gracias, Karine, por la invitación y la organización. Es un gran placer de volver aquí en el Colegio de México. Pero... Ok. Creo que es bien. Gracias. Es muy interesante de comparar entre contextos diferentes, but I shall speak in English. The first thing that is interesting about this comparison is that what Bahiyah was pointing out is that in certain contexts, the urgency to prove one's economic use is greater than in others. By contrast, indeed, both in France and in the US, there has been no such effort at the beginning. On the contrary, in many ways, there has been an effort at finding a theoretical justification and not a pragmatic one, I think. However, there is one context which I think is quite similar in different places. It's the very fact of resistance to gender studies, whatever their name. And this, I think, creates a sort of obvious solidarity between our different experiences. I want to make 4 remarks. One has to do with the fact that I happen to be identified by myself and by others and by the state as a man. There was a discussion about gender studies, women's studies, studies about women, studies by women, etc. So the question of who is speaking has always been important, and I think it has a history. That is, it's still important today. That is, my own gender is not erased, whether it is mentioned or not, when I speak on those issues. But I think it is important to notice that it was more unlikely to have a man sitting at such a table 30 years ago or 40 years ago than it is now. I'm stating the obvious, maybe, but I think it may be worth making it explicit. I think that the idea that women's studies were studies by women in many ways went without saying, even though it was also made explicit in the past. Now, this has fueled accusations that have been mentioned by Anne, that basically there was a sort of self-segregation by women, and this so-called ghettoization of gender studies, and the same has been said about other minorities. For example, blacks speaking up and accused of remaining among blacks, etc. I happen to have spent my professional and political life working on speaking about minority issues without belonging to any minority category, as far as I know, or yet. And it seems to me that what is remarkable is that the main reason why minority studies, including women's studies, tend to be the work of women and of minorities is because majority people don't want to do it. Because many women, as we know, don't work in gender studies. But relatively few men work in gender studies. So the problem is not the absence or the presence of women, but the absence of men only in certain fields. And this is also true about whites in studies about racial minorities, etc. So it's a point that I want to make, because the accusation that has often been leveled against women for sort of remaining in a sort of ghetto, I think should be turned around. There's a male ghetto, which I think has to be questioned. The second remark that I want to make is that Anne, in particular, in her presentation, reminded us of the context of emergence of such of this program, but more generally of women's studies and of the women's movement in the early 1970s. And this context is, on the one hand, the post-68 political climate, and on the other hand, its institutionalization through a university in particular at Vincennes. The fact that there's a political dimension that is explicit from the start also means that there were political tensions from the start. And not just political tensions between, say, conservatives on the one hand and progressives, whatever that means, on the other hand. There were also very powerful tensions, and this is not specific to France, among so-called progressives. That is, it's not everyone on the left that was so excited about the emergence of women's studies, if I may put it this way. And I think these tensions are important to remember because they've always been around. They have not disappeared. Constantly we're asked if we're not distracting from serious issues, that is, other issues, such as class, as if women and gender had nothing to do with class. And so it seems to me that these tensions have been important. Another kind of tension, which has also been important from the start and which has not disappeared, even though it is of a different nature, is between studies about gender and studies about sexuality. Or to put it differently, studies that have to do mostly with women, even though, of course, I'm aware that sexuality is also a women's issue. And on the other hand, issues that have to do with homosexuality. So the feminist movement and women's studies have been strongly divided by issues having to do with homosexuality, with lesbianism, etc. So when I say etc., what I mean is that on the one hand, there's the question of the competition, say, with the gay movement, but on the other hand, there's the question of the internal division between straight and lesbian feminists. So I think it is important because it has played a role. It has not disappeared today. We're speaking mostly about the past today, and we'll speak about the present tomorrow, but I think it's something to bear in mind. The third point that I want to make is about the paradox of institutionalization. On the one hand, women's studies were born from a social movement, just like gay and lesbian studies were born from a social movement. But at the same time, because it is a field of studies, it has had to acquire autonomy. That is, once you create an academic field, the academic field is different from the social movement it purports to embody academically. So I think this is a constant tension as well. And it's a tension on two fronts. One that has been mentioned before, that is the accusations, and I think it was Soledad who mentioned that, the accusations that women's studies are not academic enough because they're too political. That's one front. But there's the other front. The other front is accusations sometimes by activists that gender studies or women's studies or whatever are not political enough. Of course, being criticized on both fronts does not prove that we're right. It is not sufficient to be criticized by everyone to be certain that what you're doing is right, but it's an indication of the tensions that I think come from all sides. And these are conditions that, again, were there from the start and have not disappeared now. The last point that I want to make is about the comparison that was also mentioned and discussed by Anne between the institutionalization in the US of women's studies or gender studies or whatever we want to call them, and the relative lack of institutionalization in France. because this is one point that I think is worth insisting upon, is that whereas we're celebrating as well the 40th anniversary of a center in France, it's an exception. And we'll have a chance to talk about this more, but it's under attack as well. So let's not have the impression that in France there's this sort of wonderful situation of gender studies. Far from it. But so how come there has been a much greater institutionalization of gender studies in the US than in France? Not that everything's perfect in the US, as we know, so I will not even get into that. And I'm not just talking about the US in general, but even more specifically about gender studies in the US. But still, if you look at journals, if you look at conferences, if you look at positions in the university, if you look at programs, etc., there has been a much greater and much earlier institutionalization in the US than in France. Anne already mentioned some of the reasons why this has been the case. I would elaborate a little bit to further her points. The first one that I would want to make is that there is indeed a difference between the role of the state in the US and in France, but in particular because the role of the state has to do also with the link between higher education and secondary education through the existence of agrégation. That is an exam of recruitment for teachers in secondary education. One of the consequences is that much of higher education is organized around the disciplines that exist in secondary education. And that's very difficult to change, because that's how everything is organized. On the contrary, in the US, there's no such connection. That is, what is taught in the university need not be taught in high school. On the contrary, it's not so much the state, but the market. Universities are a market, which means that if there's a new field, it is worth trying to establish some kind of a program, which may not be very solid, which may not last forever, but you never know. If it works, if you get enough students, if it attracts people, if it attracts notoriety, then let's do it. This, for the moment, has not had any reality in France. Attracting students, for example, has no value whatsoever. It is not taken into account. So you have very different logics. The paradox is that the market logic of American universities has made them more open to innovation. I am not defending the market by saying that, but I'm pointing out what is a paradox. There's another element which I think has to do with the political history. Anne was mentioning the Republican Universalist tradition in France. I would frame it slightly differently by pointing out that this has not always been the case in France. It's not something that is inherent in French culture. It is a language that emerged in particular in the 1980s. No one in the 1970s claimed to be a universalist. It was anything but cool. So the idea that universalism is what France is all about is what surfaced in the 1980s. So what happened in the 1980s? Well, the comparison with the US, again, is interesting. In the US, the 1980s, it's the moral majority. It's the Reagan years, so it's a conservative backlash. As a consequence, the social movements of the 1970s have tried to retreat in the university. The university in the US has played a role to sort of make room for all these radicals who were in some ways marginalized in the public sphere. So the paradox is it's the political defeat of the left that has made it possible to have a relative academic success of the left in the US. Hence, later in the 1990s, the critique leveled against academic radicals for being purely academic, for producing purely theoretical arguments that had no bearing on reality. But this, I think, has to do with a history, a specific history. In France, by contrast, in the 1980s, you don't have Reagan, you have Mitterrand, a left-wing president. And the paradox is that the rise to power of the left has meant the collapse of left-wing intellectual life. And it's quite clear, if you look, I mean, the death of Sartre can be taken as a symbol. It's the end of anything that looks like 1970s radical thinking, and a systematic critique of what is called la pensée 68, that is 68 thought. So the rise to power of the left has coincided with the intellectual defeat, at least for a while, of the intellectual left. So these contexts are important, and so I would insist on the fact that we should not interpret them in cultural terms, that is, it's France, or it's the US. If only because, as we know, and as Anne knows as much as I do, the cultural or culturalist interpretation is always used, and in particular has been in France, to say, we don't want to do gender because that's American. And we're not Americans, we're French. And we want to preserve our culture. So I think it is important always to pay attention to what kind of interpretation we provide. We don't want to use cultural explanations because they're used by those who want to sort of keep everything out by saying it's not part of our culture. So anything new is bad, by definition. So if we're interested in some kind of change, I think history is a better resource than culture. So thanks very much.
Wow, muchas gracias, Eric, por traer en la mesa estos 4 puntos de discusiones. De hecho, me hizo pensar y recordar que en el PM, si bien recibimos a hombres, ¿no? Y no estamos, nunca hubo un profesor investigador, ¿no? Adscrito al PM. Así, solamente por mencionarlo. Ahora quisiera abrir al público para escuchar sus comentarios y preguntas. A ver, ¿sí?
Sí, bueno, yo quisiera preguntarle a Eric si me podría explicar un poco más acerca de su idea de por qué es mejor la historia que la cultura. Por favor.
On répond tout de suite? Tout de suite?
Ajá, sí. Breve.
To put it briefly, what I want to suggest is that if we start making comparisons between our different countries, there's a risk that we end up saying, well, things happen this way in Mexico because it's Mexico. Things happen this way in Malaysia because, well, that's Malaysia. Things happen like this in France, well, you know the French. And Americans are Americans. And this tautology, that is France, Mexico is Mexico, makes it impossible to imagine the possibility of change, and therefore makes it impossible to have politics. Because politics is about wanting the world to be this way or that way, that is changing things. So I don't know if I'm clearer in saying that, but if we emphasize history, that is the fact that things have changed, it's more difficult to fall under the illusion of culture which doesn't change. So I think the political stakes of this are considerable.
Hay dos. Gracias. Creo que, bueno, no creo, me parece muy interesante todo lo que han comentado y recuperar como la historia de los estudios de las mujeres, del feminismo, de género. Y Eric plantea algo que a mí también me causaba duda, el hecho de cuando llegan, digamos, y se discute esto de los estudios de género y las masculinidades y el papel de los hombres y demás, ¿qué pasa en estos espacios de mujeres? ¿Cómo confrontan o cómo asumen el hecho de que hay que estudiar ahora también la situación de los hombres, ¿no? ¿Qué sucede? Y también, ¿qué sucede en sus centros o institutos con respecto a esta parte de los estudios de género? ¿Incluyen ya estudios de las masculinidades o no? ¿Y cuándo pasa esto? Yo sé que hay mesas también para el presente y el futuro, y no sé si allá lo van a abordar, pero era como una duda que me surgía ahora, ¿no? Además, bueno, de lo que ya comentaba también Karine, sobre cuántos hombres hay también en los estudios de las mujeres, y por qué ha sucedido esto, cuál es la postura de que entren o no los hombres en los espacios, digamos, construidos históricamente por mujeres, ¿no? Gracias.
First, I mean, Eric is today a living testimony to that, but in fact, the Paris 8 Center was always included men, including at the very beginning. And that's a testimony to also what was going on at that time. I mean, they were, I could name then, I mean, there was a historian, Jean-Louis Flandrin, and an anthropologist, etc. So there has always been men, even though the majority was women, and there has always been men, you know, whether they identified as men or not, in our classes. Then, of course, well, I mean, I'm not. It's true that in France, there is another question in your question, which is, you know, how we frame the problems. If you talk about, for instance, masculinity studies, then the question that you raise is the question of identity or identities or social identities, etc. And that in itself is a problem. So I think that in a center like Paris 8, sorry, you know, we've always even when it was, you know, feminine studies, so to speak, which actually questioned the binary between man and woman, the normative binary, or of course when you have gender studies, which is a relational notion, perhaps concept indeed. You cannot raise the question of women or femininity normative or not without posing the question of, you know, the formation. It's actually, you necessarily, as soon as you raise the question, if you denaturalize, you know, gender norms, you denaturalize the virility norms, masculine norms, masculinity norms, as well as femininity, in one and the same thrust. Now, I think that it's true that a difference, for instance, between, I mean, an institutional difference between the States and France is that in the States, for instance, as of the 90s, they started developing, you know, in many universities, as Eric was reminding us, LGBT studies, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, etc., which were separate research entities, sometimes with separate diplomas, many times at the same time, which had a privileged connection to earlier, for instance, women's studies or gender studies programs. In France, it hasn't happened this way, and it's an interesting question, actually. But the result is that centers like ours, for instance, make a point of raising all the questions, which is to say, our centers are centers that deal not only with so-called traditional women's studies issues, but also, you know, LGBT, sorry, Q, etc. Issues. and therefore, that involve masculinity studies. So that's a small element of answer.
Una aclaración a lo que dijo Karine. En el PIEM, desde hace mucho tiempo, tenemos la participación de profesores que trabajan masculinidades, Nelson Minello y Juan Guillermo Figueroa. Y una vez un investigador ganó un concurso para ocupar una plaza en el PIEM. Él trabajaba masculinidades o trabaja, pero se dejó tentar por la universidad japonesa en la que trabajaba. Le ofrecieron condiciones mejores que las que ofrecíamos nosotros, y en este caso lo que hubo es una autoexclusión, como señalaba Eric, y no de nuestra parte. Y quería hacer una pregunta a Eric y a Anne sobre esta cuestión de los ataques al centro. ¿Cuál es la naturaleza de esos ataques, los argumentos que se manejan? ¿Cómo?
Should we answer today, or should we, because it's going to be the discussion of, I mean, if we're talking about the present, I mean, we're talking. Can I say one thing about masculinity and the studies of this, studying men? So not just men speaking about all this, but also men being the object of study. As we all know, man has always been the object of study. So what's new? What's new is that it's become men as such. That is, instead of, I mean, the first move of women's studies and gender studies was to say, when you talk about man, you're obliterating the existence of women. You leave them out. The second move was to say, well, let's not forget about men. Not because we want to take men back into the picture, they've always been in the picture, but because instead of being the embodiment of the universal, they become as particular as women have always been. So it's a move to particularize those who, until recently, could legitimately feel that they embodied the universal. And the same has happened in terms of studies of sexuality. Gay and lesbian studies have made heterosexuality visible. Of course, heterosexuality has been visible forever, but not as such, not as a norm. In the same way, in race studies, whiteness has become an object of study. That is, the invisible norm has been made visible. So I think there's something comparable in all these fields.
Could I say something about this? Yeah, I think it's very interesting, your question about masculinity. For us, masculinity is a very important issue in Malaysia, especially now with looking at the West and important things like ICT coming into the picture and media. So a lot of studies with our students are looking into how these are depicted and brought out, not through just the media, but also through things like comics. You talk about Japan. It's a very, very interesting aspect in Japan because you have anime. We are looking into these aspects of how comic characters become life, like, and you have masquerades of this, how people just start to embody who these characters are within them. Women become men, men become women. There are many different kinds of men, many different kinds of women. These are things, the intersections between these are so important, especially in Malaysia, because we now have the Korean wave, the Hangyu, and also the Japanese wave that's come to us. So other than looking at the West, we are looking now at the East, where these, converge, in the areas that we have. So we've looked towards, the embodiments of this in our Malaysian society, and it's got very, very interesting things to say about this. Thank you.
Sí, buenas tardes. Soledad, a mí me gustaría que me hicieras favor de contestar esta pregunta, que en realidad pues tiene dos partes, ¿no? Pienso que cada país tiene su proyecto de país. La educación que se da en cada país es coherente con su cultura. Y en este sentido, pues pienso que en su mayoría la sociedad refleja ese proyecto. Yo recuerdo que José Ortega y Gasset, filósofo y esteta, reconoció hace 100 años a 7 sabios mexicanos. 2 de ellos formaron 2 partidos políticos en México. Y creo que eran personas tan conscientes de la realidad mexicana que en 1952 las mujeres mexicanas tuvimos el voto muy adelantado a lo que en muchos lugares de Europa lo tuvieron. Las mujeres en la Revolución Mexicana se hicieron presentes en la historia y prácticamente en la historia de México las mujeres no han estado a un lado. Si en un momento, por ejemplo, las personas hablaban de Frida Kahlo diciendo que era la esposa de Diego Rivera, llegó un momento en que Diego Rivera, hoy por hoy, es el esposo de Frida Kahlo. Entonces, en este sentido, ¿cómo vinculan los estudios de género a la presencia activa de las mujeres en la historia de cada país? Y también me refiero, por ejemplo, en Francia, Olympe de Gauche fue decapitada por Robespierre porque ella hizo la cosa de droit et de citoyenne, ¿no? Entonces creo que no hay que dejar de lado tampoco la imagen de las mujeres que han estado por debajo, aunque pues obviamente sabemos que la historia la escribe quien gana y en este caso habían sido los hombres, pero también estamos presentes las mujeres. Eso es por un lado. Y por otro lado, yo quisiera saber también dónde estamos, no tanto en los estudios de género y en la academia, sino también en la sociedad. Gracias.
Bueno, con respecto a la primera parte de la pregunta, uno de los primeros espacios que abrió el PIEM fue un seminario taller para discutir los trabajos de investigación sobre distintos aspectos de las historias múltiples de las mujeres en diferentes periodos de la vida mexicana. Y como producto de este primer seminario salió el libro Presencia y Transparencia, justamente con la palabra presencia en primer lugar. Luego siguieron otros seminarios, la línea de trabajos históricos continuó. Por ejemplo, publicamos un libro precioso de Blanca López de Mariscal sobre la imagen de las mujeres en los relatos de la conquista. Luego Lucía Melgar reunió una serie de trabajos históricos, ahora no me acuerdo del título del libro, ¿tú te acuerdas? Resistencia, como persistencia y cambio, en fin, a lo largo de sus 30 años de historia, el PIEM ha sido un espacio para el trabajo sobre la historia de las mujeres, la participación política en diferentes ámbitos, en el movimiento urbano popular, en las organizaciones campesinas, en fin, creo que sí hemos trabajado mucho al respecto, hemos sido un espacio de convergencia de diferentes puntos de vista con respecto a la participación de las mujeres en la política, en fin. Y con respecto a dónde estamos, creo que eso es lo que se va a tratar mañana. Así que les dejo a las compañeras que participan mañana para que desarrollen plenamente el tema.
Sí, hoy estuvimos sentando un poco las bases de la discusión. O sea, se trató de decir, pues, miramos hacia el pasado, pero estas miradas hacia el pasado forzosamente tienen un vínculo con lo que está pasando con el presente y con lo que pasará mañana, ¿no? Entonces, todo esto está entrelazado y les invitamos a seguirnos mañana para la segunda parte de la discusión. Sobre todo, entreguen sus cascos y sus aparatitos, es muy importante como detalle. Sobre todo quisiera agradecer a nuestros dos traductores porque es difícil. Bueno, pues muchas gracias y nos vemos mañana. Adiós. Sí, una precisión. Será aquí mismo mañana por la mañana.